My name is Mara. I am 33, and the story of how a polite layoff became a confession begins at 9:17 p.m. in a one-bedroom apartment in Austin, Texas, where the ceiling fan hummed like a tired metronome over a body I was still learning to move inside. 10 days earlier, I had carried a cardboard box past kombucha taps and a wall of motivational vinyl that had learned to impersonate kindness. I told myself the script that corporations hand out like gauze: market conditions, strategic realignment, difficult decisions, because repeating a palatable fiction sometimes hurts less than naming a brutal fact. At 9:17 p.m., I asked the only question that still had a pulse inside me, pressed send, and watched 3 gray dots bloom and vanish like a skittish animal. The answer arrived with the brutal neatness of a printed receipt. I had been replaced because my leave would jeopardize an investor's timeline. The company needed someone reliable. Reliable meant not pregnant. Reliable meant a body that could be filed under resource without any asterisk. Reliable meant the ultrasound picture propped on my nightstand had been silently converted into a risk metric in a meeting I did not attend. The shock did not present itself as fire. It arrived as stillness. I lay back and counted the fan blades as if slow arithmetic could unbraid what had just tightened around my throat. The city's noise came through the windows as routine proof that other lives continued. A car door clicked, tires whispered on asphalt, a neighbor's music thumped through drywall like a muffled heartbeat. I tried to climb back into the official story the way a child tries to fit into a coat that has already been outgrown. It would not close. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from, and please hit like and subscribe to follow how this text at 9:17 p.m. turned a clean layoff into a case and a quiet woman into a witness. This journey is about what happens when a company calls pregnancy a scheduling problem and a person decides to answer with her whole life. The words that broke the spell were not dramatic. Investor's client pushed back. Leave would jeopardize rollout. Need someone reliable. In those spare syllables lived a room I could picture without ever having seen it: the long table, the coffee cooling, the whiteboard smeared with arrows, the risk matrices where my body had been turned into a red cell labeled exposure. I could hear a voice suggesting adjustments, another voice rejecting the uncertainty of accommodating a human timeline, a legal voice advising precision but leaving cracks. I could feel the moment the decision rebranded itself as necessity. It was not malice, I told myself, which did not make it better. It was something colder, the worship of velocity dressed as stewardship. When I was a child in Ohio, my mother starched my collars and my resolve at the same ironing board. She worked hospital nights and taught me that work could be both passport and shield, a way to move forward and a way to not be moved against your will. I carried that creed to Austin and built a professional life like a clean ledger. Campaigns launched, teams mentored, crises absorbed without complaint, slides that made complexity look inevitable. Pregnancy did not feel like an exit from that life, only a door opening into it at a different angle. I color-coded a handoff plan, recorded walkthroughs, lined up coverage in a document titled Reliability Shared, convinced that reliability was something you proved with scaffolding and grace. Apparently, reliability was also something you performed as a body that promised not to interrupt the quarter. Shame had been my companion in the interim between box and text. Shame is efficient and portable. It does not require facts to reproduce. Maybe I missed a forecast. Maybe my last deck looked cleaner than it truly was. Maybe the board felt I was less persuasive than I believed. The text acted like sunlight on mold. The shame retreated, thin and frantic, and in its place rose a steadier sensation I had not expected, relief braided with fury. Relief because the story stopped accusing me of a private failure. Fury because the truth accused a larger room of a familiar crime. I set the phone face down and felt the gravity of the moment settle into the floorboards, the way a house changes when you move heavy furniture. I did not respond. The silence I held next was not bewilderment. It was preservation. I opened my notes app and wrote the words exactly as they had been delivered. Timestamp and all, because memory, under pressure, becomes malleable. And I had already decided that this version of my life would be the last one I allowed to be softened for anyone's comfort. I emailed the screenshot to myself with a subject line I would later recognize as the name of a new file in my mind, Reliable Text 917. Evidence has a calming effect on a nervous system that has been trained to self-doubt. Paper steadies a person even when the paper is digital, and the steadiness is a decision. The rituals of ordinary life continued. I drank water in deliberate sips because nausea had a hair trigger, and I had learned to negotiate with it like weather. I checked my bank balance and my calendar because those two rectangles shape most modern fates. I looked at the small bassinet we had found at a consignment shop on North Loop, still folded, still theoretical. I walked my fingertips across the ridge where the wall's paint changed shade because landlords never quite matched touch-ups, and the little seam annoyed me in ways that felt bigger than paint. In the corner, a lavender plant from my desk bent toward a window that offered what sun it could. I understood that the next part of this story would require a kind of endurance that would not look like heroics from the outside. It would look like record-keeping and boundaries, and the slow refusal to be turned into a cautionary tale. The city outside did not care that my life had shifted. Austin's cranes pointed at an ever-after only they believed in. Joggers kept slicing evening air with one more mile. Delivery bikes kept their restless choreography. In a world that performs acceleration, choosing to slow down long enough to gather yourself can feel like disobedience. I closed my eyes and tried on the word witness. It did not feel like a costume. It felt like a right. By the time Austin called my name in a recruiter's polite email, I had learned how to turn scarcity into momentum. Ohio taught that lesson without theatrics. Winter insists. Bus schedules become scripture. You keep going or the cold writes your story for you. My mother practiced the gospel of continuation, and I learned to conjugate it in every tense. She weighed fatigue against bills and chose the math that kept us moving. She measured love in ironed hems and lunches assembled at 4:45 a.m., in laughter stored for later and used when the day came home crooked. The first spreadsheets I ever touched were not software. They were lists on ruled paper where she balanced hours and coupons and my future in the same neat hand. Ambition arrived disguised as gratitude. I said yes to internships where the currency was proximity to power. I said yes to roles that promised a view of the room where decisions lived, even if my chair was against the wall. Hardware retail taught me about margins and patience. A scrappy nonprofit taught me about impact and the peculiar intimacy of trust between a small staff that has to believe or fold. I wrote posts that made donors feel seen. I learned the rhythm of deadlines that circle back like seasons. I learned to hold my voice steady in rooms that awarded steadiness to different faces. Austin's heat felt like a dare the first August. I stepped onto its sidewalks as a new hire with a badge and a job title that made my mother smile. Venture capital smells like confidence with a citrus top note. An open office hums with hunger. Kombucha taps and meditation rooms pose as mercy while calendars betray the truth. I learned what it meant to treat a quarter like a story with 3 acts and a twist. I learned how board decks wanted narrative arcs nested inside financials. I learned to compress chaos into slides so clean they could pass as serenity. I learned to redirect credit without bleeding out. Alina arrived after a year of sprinting and made the room feel, briefly, like it had windows that opened. Her presence carried the particular relief of competent stewardship. She asked for context, which is rarer than curiosity. She saw the shape of my work not as a stack of deliverables, but as a body of thought. She told me to save my spine for moments that deserved it, which sounded like both wisdom and permission. I did not mistake her grace for shelter. Still, I stood nearer to it when storms brewed. When pregnancy entered the frame, I approached it with the same discipline I had used to tame product launches. I built templates no one had asked for because I wanted readiness to be legible. I reduced a complex transition into checklists that dignified every person whose name would move into boxes I once carried alone. I created a cadence that let my team feel seen while also training them to operate without my daily shadow. I did not think of myself as essential in the egotistical way. I thought of myself as responsible in the architectural way. I believed that a well-designed structure could hold weight even when the original engineer took a necessary leave. The culture around me tried to play benevolent. Jokes presented themselves as support, but contained small footnotes about disruption. Advice arrived as folklore disguised as care. An executive father told a story about how his partner never really returned after their third child, as if wander and ruin were synonyms. An associate commented on how efficient I was, with a smile that carried a question about how long efficiency can coexist with expansion. I carried these remarks into a private ledger not to nurse grievances, but to map currents. Environments tell on themselves when they think they are merely speaking. The layoff invite landed on a Monday afternoon, a calendar square named with the gentle euphemism that has fired more people than any other: quick sync. I showed up with my notebook and the pen I used for situations where words would need to hold. The HR representative wore neutrality like armor. The glass room turned my face into a faint overlay of the parking lot. The phrasing was formalized commerce. The packet felt both heavy and hollow. I did not argue because the performance required of me was exit, and I had learned not to give rooms the drama they could later quote against me. I packed a plant, a mug, and the object that had absorbed my hours more faithfully than any job, the body I carried. At home, I practiced the discipline of forward motion, apply for Cobra, list the contacts I could reach for projects, rework the budget, rearrange the apartment so that the bassinet would not feel like a question I could not yet answer. For 10 days, I wore the official story like a coat that pinched. Then I asked why. The answer rearranged the furniture of my mind. The coat split along a seam I could no longer pretend not to feel. The architecture of my patience shifted to accommodate a new load. I took the first step that every person who decides to stop swallowing must take. I began an archive. I have always trusted paper more than memory. Memory bends when frightened. Paper keeps its shape unless you set it on fire. The moment the message affirmed what my body had suspected, I became a recorder who also happened to be a woman who was pregnant and unemployed. The duality felt both clinical and intimate. I saved the screenshot to 3 places because redundancy is a love language. I exported calendars that traced my careful handoff plan. I built a document titled Weather Report and filled it with observations that had not seemed important enough to name while they happened. Each entry carried a date, a location, and the sentence that landed wrong without fanfare: a joke about baby buffers, a comment about focus, a meeting moved up as if compression were not its own source of failure. None of these would, by themselves, prove intent. Together, they mapped a climate. The apartment became a small legal pad with plants. I labeled a folder after time and put inside it a printed copy of the message with the word reliable underlined, not because I needed the emphasis, but because ritual helps anger settle into clarity. Rage without aim exhausts. Rage with documentation becomes resolve. I read the federal language that prohibits turning pregnancy into a professional penalty. I read state language that braided itself to the federal promises with local threads. The words were skeletal and needed muscle, but they existed. It is astonishing how much steadier a person stands when the words exist. The morning after the message, I traced a plan. First, refuse to be hurried. Second, consult someone whose job it is to turn harm into argument. Third, anticipate the story the company would prefer and collect the necessary contradictions. Fourth, remain human in the middle of it, because processes have a way of convincing people to forget their center. I brewed tea that I would likely forget to drink and typed out a history of the last quarter that contained more care than any performance review I had ever received. I wrote it for myself, to prevent erasure. I also wrote it for a future I could not yet see, where someone would ask, and I would answer without flinching. The city outside pursued its regular appetite for novelty. New cranes raised their thin metal necks into a washed sky. New restaurants opened and closed like mouths. New arrivals took photos with murals and posted captions about dreams. Inside our small place, I practiced stillness as rebellion. I breathed in sets of 4 counts, because a nurse once taught my mother a trick for steadying overwhelmed patients, and my mother passed it on as if breathing were a family business. I placed my hand where the child within me registered their existence with a small, declarative presence that needed no words. I promised, silently but with more certainty than anything I had said aloud all week, that I would build a world worthy of this tiny, stubborn heartbeat. I considered the math of silence. There was money on the table I had not yet seen but could already imagine. There would be a price for telling the truth, too. Prices are rarely absent, they only switch labels. Friends would advise pragmatism, and their love would sound like caution because they wanted me safe. Work acquaintances would go quiet, not because they disapproved, but because they feared association. The industry would keep spinning as if no one had ever fallen from it mid-stride. The question, then, was not whether this would cost me. The question was which currency I could live with and sleep beside. I opened my laptop and drafted an email to an employment attorney whose website conveyed competence without performative indignation. The message contained only facts and attachments, and the sentence that mattered most. I have direct written confirmation that my pregnancy was treated as a risk to be managed rather than a condition to be accommodated. The reply came back with an appointment time and a list of documents to bring. I printed what I could and stacked it with the kind of care usually reserved for heirlooms. Evidence, too, can be an heirloom if you intend to pass on a world better than the one that tried you. At noon, I walked around the block because motion soothes. The sun made the sidewalk into a decision. The oak trees along our street threw their franchise of shade. I pictured the office I had left, the glass rooms, the whiteboards full of arrows, the lavender plant leaning toward artificial light. I did not crave return. I craved repair. Repair would not look like apology from a person whose power resided in staying comfortable. Repair would look like accountability written in a language companies endorse, policy, payment, precedent. Back upstairs, I placed the printed message in a folder and slid it into the drawer that holds our passports. The symbolism was intentional and unnecessary. It made me smile despite everything. If work had once been my passport, this piece of paper now issued me into a different country where my name would not be the only thing between me and a story I refused to inherit. Silence is a currency with deceptively soft edges. It folds easily. It slides into envelopes and contracts with clauses designed to sound like mutual respect. It promises rest from the storm, and in the short term, it often delivers. $30,000 is not a metaphor. It pays rent, prenatal care, groceries that taste like stability. It also buys a version of events where my life becomes an unrecorded exception, a private compromise that ensures a public pattern continues uninterrupted. The offer arrived typed in a serif that wanted to telegraph seriousness. The documents pages felt substantial between my fingers, as if weight could substitute for worth. I read every clause twice, and then a third time because familiarity reveals what attention misses on a first pass. Non-admission of wrongdoing. Full and final settlement of claims known and unknown. Mutual non-disparagement that treated truth as a threat instead of a cure. Continuation of health benefits through a narrow window that implied generosity while aligning perfectly with a quarter's accounting needs. The math made a kind of sense that prided itself on refusing to see the person inside the numbers. I understood the seduction. I also recognized its cost the way a body recognizes an old injury when the weather changes. I set the packet on the table and examined the surface around it, a ring from a cup placed down without a coaster, a scratch Evan once buffed and then accepted, a small scuff near the corner where I had slid a heavy book too carelessly. The table had absorbed our life without complaint. I wondered what it would mean for me to become a surface that absorbed this, too. I thought of my mother ironing at dawn, pressing fabric into compliance with heat and steam, training unruly fibers to lie flat for as long as the day required. I thought of how many women I knew who had been trained to keep the day from wrinkling no matter how the world handled them. I pictured the investor who had insisted that the rollout remain unruffled by my leave. I pictured the client who believed stability was a synonym for feminine absence. I pictured the meeting where someone said that my absence would jeopardize outcomes, and I pictured the nods from people who treasured their seat at the table more than the fairness of the feast. Accepting the offer would not punish those people. It would reward the calculus that made them possible. It would signal that the system could price out resistance the way a city prices out neighborhoods, that relief could be purchased, and therefore structural change could be indefinitely postponed. I listed what silence would buy and what it would sell. It would buy breathing room. It would sell my voice. It would buy time to prepare for a newborn in a world that rarely equips parents with anything more than platitudes and thin leave policies. It would sell the possibility that, by refusing, I might help someone I will never meet in a future room where a woman's body is not treated as an asterisk. I am not a martyr by temperament. I wanted the cushion. I also wanted to look my future child in the eye one day and tell the truth about what I did when invited to disappear. I did not demonize Alina. I interrogated the pattern that had passed through her hands. People in systems become conduits for harm without waking up intending it. They wake up intending to keep deadlines, impress capital, make the road smoother for their own families. They tell themselves someone else will fix it later, after the launch, after the quarter, after the next fundraise, after the child sleeps through the night. Later becomes a habit. Habits become culture. Culture becomes harm written in a font that reads as professionalism. I contacted counsel and asked them to translate my resolve into terms a company would recognize. The letter they drafted did not perform outrage. It performed precision. It named the statutes that treat pregnancy as a condition that must be accommodated rather than punished. It attached the archive I had assembled not as an act of aggression, but as an act of alignment with the facts. It proposed a resolution that included compensation commensurate with the damage done, changes to policy, and training that would move the burden from individuals' goodwill to institutional obligation. It insisted that confidentiality not be used as a veil to preserve a practice the law had already rejected. While the letter traveled, life did not freeze. Evan filed frets and intonated instruments at his bench, coaxing recalcitrant wood and wire into resonance. Neighbors carried groceries, took deliveries, argued faintly about dishes, laughed at something on a screen. My body asked to be fed at inconvenient intervals, and I complied with crackers and slices of cheese eaten standing up. I kept moving with intention because stagnation is loud in small apartments. I rearranged the closet to make space for a stroller that had not yet arrived. I folded tiny clothes that felt like the world's most tender manifesto. I repeated to myself that refusing to be purchased was not impractical. It was strategic. When the response came back, it wore the same careful serif as the offer. It defended the restructuring with language that tried to be both sympathetic and adamant. It referenced performance in ways that attempted to blur the bright line drawn by the message. It offered an adjusted number and a tighter clause, as if generosity were a game of inches. It proposed a reference letter that would praise my contributions while declining to mention why those contributions had been cut off at the point they were needed most. It attempted to relocate the problem to a hazy landscape where no one could be blamed, because the market is an indifferent god. I read the letter on the couch with my feet up on the armrest, because circulation had become a negotiation, and small comforts were part of my strategy for not burning out. I felt the tug to say yes the way a person feels the tug to sleep in a storm when exhaustion has piled up like waves. I also felt the quiet insistence of a different tug, the one that points toward a future in which my child learns that ease is not the only inheritance worth leaving. I closed the laptop and pressed my palms to either side of my abdomen and breathed in counts of 4. I chose the fight. The choice to refuse was not a single dramatic moment. It was a daily practice that returned each time a new email tried to reframe reality. The company's reply arrived dressed in civility and percentages, a careful attempt to depersonalize the event that had colored every corner of my life. It leaned on abstractions, as if restructuring were a weather system unconnected to human hands, as if the message that had named my body a scheduling risk could be tucked back into a file and called unfortunate rather than determinative. I read it with an expression I had learned in 100 meetings, neutral enough to be mistaken for agreement, alert enough to be unwilling to concede. Refusing brought its own math. Groceries changed shape. The list at the end of each week reflected a new discipline, one that treated every choice as a vote for a future I could live with. I discovered a hard truth that people sometimes wrap in slogans and call empowerment. Principles and bills are simultaneously real, and living both at the same time requires precision that seldom receives applause. I reorganized the apartment to make space in more than the physical sense. I stacked folders where a plant had been. I moved a chair to catch a new angle of light, because light has always been the cheapest medicine. I practiced a ritual I had learned from my mother, but never fully understood until now, the way steadfastness becomes its own meal when the fridge feels thin. The counteroffer tried to seduce through reasonableness. It suggested that any injury could be absorbed by a number, that harm could be amortized across months and language that sounded heavy enough to hold. It adjusted the severance and tightened the gag. It proposed a letter that would praise what could be praised while maintaining a silence about what had ended that praise. It gestured toward the future career it assumed I must be pressing my face against, as if the only worthwhile outcome here were a return to an old kind of normal. It assumed my priority was to remain employable to people who would prefer my story not be told. In a younger life, I might have accepted that premise without noticing the trap. I was an older version of myself now, and older in this sense meant clearer. Refusing quieted some circles and lit others. People in my orbit split themselves without being asked. Some withdrew, gently or quickly, convinced distance was the safest kindness they could afford to themselves. Others stepped closer, offering what they had, a spreadsheet template that made expenses look less like a cliff. The name of a clinic billing coordinator who knew how to navigate charity programs. A story about a cousin who had walked this road years earlier without the text that I held now. Each gesture threaded a new stitch into a net I had once pretended I did not need. Independence had been one of my favorite myths. I practiced a better one, interdependence that did not require apology. I caught myself wanting to narrate the company with a single word that would let me find rest in contempt. That instinct felt briefly satisfying and ultimately dishonest. An institution is a chorus of incentives, rituals, and habits, some shaped by decent people who never pause to trace the consequences of their compromises. If I wanted change, I needed more than a story that declared the other side simply bad. I needed to target the gears and pulleys that lead even reasonable people to call a pregnant worker unreliable, while praising a father for taking a few afternoons for soccer. I needed to characterize the harm in terms the system feared losing: talent, consistency, reputation, the ability to recruit people who believe their efforts will be returned with minimal fairness. The pregnancy itself reshaped time. Naps became strategic rather than indulgent. Meals happened on a schedule my body dictated. Fatigue behaved like weather in a desert, sudden, absolute, requiring you to cross to shade and wait without fighting. I revised my plan for the coming months as if I were building a product with a team that refused to pretend resources were infinite. The team, in this case, was the pair of us at home and the small network that had revealed itself in the last few weeks. The roadmap replaced revenue targets with milestones that sounded private but felt radical: secure health coverage without conceding voice, file on time without losing the thread of daily life, protect the space around my mind the way I had spent years protecting a brand from chaos. The decision to file became a day on the calendar rather than an abstraction. The paperwork felt both sacred and blunt, full of boxes that wanted facts without the blood still on them. I answered in the grammar of the institution, because that grammar unlocks doors, and I promised myself I would still find a way to slip the human story through the hinge. The act of writing the narrative statement sheared the heat off my anger and left the ember that matters, the one that keeps you warm through a long process, rather than the one that burns down the room and leaves you with ash where a case should be. I mailed the packet with muscle memory from 1,000 launches. Check, double check, kiss the seal for luck, keep the tracking number close. After filing, the quiet carried a new acoustics. Waiting can be chaos in a nice suit. I learned to pace my attention. Mornings belonged to paperwork and phone calls. Afternoons served recovery. Naps, walks to loosen a back that protested the chair, small errands that preserved the ritual of living. Evenings stretched, and I filled them with actions that returned me to myself. Slow cooking that turned cheap ingredients into care. Laundry that made stacks from piles. Reading that reminded me there are rooms in this world where ethics are not the punchline. The baby's movements became the underlying music that tuned the day. Each small thud argued for a timeline larger than any quarter. I kept thinking about the word reliable. If I could rewrite corporate dictionaries, I would enshrine a definition that might actually stabilize companies that claim to worship stability. Reliable means building a system that not only survives but thrives when humans need humane things. Reliable means not centering speed over sense so completely that you destroy the very trust you need to retain talent. Reliable means, of course, when a worker announces a pregnancy, not if only. Reliability, overstated on values pages, measured by accelerations alone, is simply extraction rebranded. I wanted a world where my refusal helped dislodge that lie even slightly. The counteroffers kept arriving with minor edits and confident tone, and I responded with the calibration my counsel recommended and my conscience welcomed. I insisted on terms that acknowledged the harm rather than purchasing amnesia. I insisted on policy changes that would outlive me, even if only by a year. I understood I might not get every ask. I also understood that conceding early would teach the wrong lesson to people I would never meet. The work of pushing back was slower than any campaign I had ever run, and in that slowness, I learned a new shape of patience, one that was not submission, one that was not fury, one that was closer to stewardship of a better room. The months between a filing and a resolution are an education in the physics of institutions. Momentum and mass dictate a great deal. The company carried mass, money, counsel, a reputation built on clean decks and clean lines. I cultivated momentum, documentation, coherence, a willingness to outlast. The interplay required consistency more than spectacle. Consistency looked like repeating the same facts with the same calm, each time someone tried to reorganize them into a version that served their needs better than the truth. Consistency looked like waking up and tending to the case before it tended to me. I began each morning with a ritual that functioned like an anchor thrown into rough water. I listed what I could control, what I could influence, and what I had to release. I learned to place only the first two on that day's agenda. The third received 3 lines in a notebook, a breath, and a clear instruction to revisit tomorrow. This was not denial, it was triage. I practiced triage with budgets and meals and attention. I had spent years treating urgency as a sign of importance. Now urgency became a suspect category subject to investigation. Anything that knocked at the door with a fist got asked for identification. The case pushed me to revisit my work history with less romance and more accuracy. I pulled old performance reviews and noted the ways I had been praised for qualities that were now being recast as liabilities under pressure. Ownership had been celebrated until ownership meant insisting the company own its obligations. Strategic flexibility had been applauded until flexibility meant asking the institution to flex rather than the pregnant worker. Courage had been mentioned as a brand attribute until courage meant resisting a tidy settlement. Marketing trains you to map contradictions in competitors. Turning that lens on a former employer felt like using a familiar tool with the safety guard removed. I also turned the lens on myself. I listed the ways I had contributed to a culture that normalized the erasure of bodies that needed accommodation. I had praised colleagues who returned early from leave as if the speed of their comeback was itself a metric of value. I had bragged about late nights and praised perfect decks more than sustainable processes. I had packaged my own exhaustion as commitment and taught people to expect it. Recognizing my part did not absolve the institution of its wrongdoing. It gave me leverage over the only lever I will always control: the way I work, the way I lead, the way I refuse to dress harm as heroism in any room I enter again. The pregnancy advanced like a tide that knew its moon. The baby's movements organized my hours. A kick meant pause and appreciate. A roll meant adjust the pillows and laugh at the physics of a body remaking a body. I measured time in appointments and in the lap count of walks around the block. Strangers' eyes softened when they saw my shape, and sometimes that softness carried assumptions I did not have energy to manage. I practiced a gaze that redirected curiosity back into polite distance. I saved my explanations for rooms that would transform them into action rather than consumption. My counsel and I debated strategies in the measured cadence of professionals who know that truth must be married to timing. Publicity offered leverage and risk. Quiet offered precision and the danger of invisibility. Neither choice was pure. The pregnancy added variables that no deck could tidy. We chose a middle path that preserved my right to speak while not rushing the story into a marketplace that treats outrage like content. I did not want my life to become a lesson delivered to strangers for a day's engagement and then discarded. I wanted policy, precedent, and a measurable shift in how the company handled the next worker whose body asked the institution to expand. The company, predictably, attempted to narrow the frame. It emphasized business needs and attempted to recontextualize the text as a clumsy personal misstep, unrelated to the decision. It floated alternative narratives that cast me as a regrettable casualty of macro conditions. It tried to replace the bright line with fog. Fog is persuasive when people are tired. I organized my days to arrive at every interaction well-rested enough to reject haze. I simplified my own message until it could be carried without wobble. Pregnancy was treated as risk. I was replaced because of it. The law forbids that. I will not be silent about it. Support arrived in forms that did not seek credit. An old colleague passed along a white paper on equitable leave policies that avoided the trap of performative benefits. A neighbor who worked in a different sector explained how their union had codified accommodations in language that could not be bent by sentiment. A nurse at the clinic whispered practicalities written in the margins of official handouts. None of these acts appeared on social feeds. They made the actual difference that internet conversations so often promise, but seldom deliver. I maintained a separate ledger for grief. Refusing the offer did not erase the immediate emotional reality that I missed my work and the parts of my team that had felt like chosen family. The rituals of a job provide identity scaffolding many of us do not notice until the structure is removed. I gave myself permission to miss the inside jokes, the banter over breakfast tacos, the quiet thrill of a campaign landing clean. I permitted that longing without turning it into an argument against the case. Both could be true. I loved the work. The institution failed me. I refused to vanish. Holding both truths at once felt like strength, disguised as ambivalence. Toward the end of the second trimester, a new letter arrived from the company. It acknowledged my documentation with a polite thanks, and then restated positions with the confidence of an entity that believes distance improves its case. It suggested mediation as a venue for reasonableness. It named a number larger than the last and wrapped it in a confidentiality structure that would have transformed my story into a secret rumor. I took a slow breath and marked the calendar for a session that would test whether reasonableness could exist without erasure. I entered the date like a waypoint and returned to the steady work of remaining whole in the waiting. In stories, aftermath follows climax. In life, aftermath begins as soon as a harm lands. The body does not wait for resolution to process impact. The night after the mediation date was set, I woke to the kind of restless alertness that belongs to emergency rooms and newborn households. My mind rehearsed possibilities while my ribs stretched around a presence that did not want to know about arbitration clauses. I treated the wakefulness as dater rather than failure. The case had changed my relationship to discomfort. Instead of seeking to erase it, I asked what it was asking me to learn. The immediate social consequences of refusing had settled into their own topology. Invitations to gatherings where my old colleagues would be present stopped arriving. The silence was not dramatic, it was efficient. Professional networks that once pulsed with offers for quick side projects cooled. People who had once relied on my availability for last-minute deck rescues learned, in my absence, either to do the work themselves or to find another person eager to be needed. Part of me mourned the shrinking of a world I had built. Another part recognized a redistribution of energy that might, in time, feel like liberation. In the days following the mediation invite, I trained for the event the way I once trained teams for investor presentations. I rehearsed the story in a way that preserved its humanity while resisting self-pity. I refined the ask until it reflected both ethical and practical needs. I anticipated the company's arguments and prepared responses that felt like clean lines rather than blows. I collected exhibits, not for spectacle, but for ease of reference. My counsel reminded me that clarity is a kindness even to opponents who do not intend to be kind. I adopted that stance because it made me better at the task, and because it kept bitterness from calcifying into identity. News of my filing traveled farther than my contact list. I learned that information moves along channels the public cannot see, whispers between recruiters, side comments at conferences, the confidential way people protect their own positioning by quietly distancing from a complication. I could not control the rumors. I could control the quality of the story I told when requested. I drafted a paragraph that contained enough detail to educate and enough restraint to avoid turning my life into entertainment. I treated my story like a professional deliverable with a human center, because that is what it had become. The pregnancy added a countdown that no project plan could move. Appointments thickened. I practiced the art of arriving without hurry, of allowing technicians to take their time finding measurements that would confirm what my body already told me. The baby's heart kept time to a rhythm indifferent to email. Indifference can be a comfort. It reminds a person that the universe wears a fabric larger than any workplace. I stored that reminder for the day when mediation would try to reduce the universe to talking points and concessions. On the morning of mediation, I ate a small breakfast that prioritized steadiness over culinary experience and put on clothes that made me feel like my spine had friends. I entered the room with the awareness that harm often tries to rebrand itself as misunderstanding when institutions feel observed. The mediator offered the ritual opening in a tone that belongs to people who believe words can govern storms. My counsel presented the through line: hiring, performance planning, the text, the replacement, the law, the refusal to sell silence. The company's counsel responded with a narrative designed to placate rather than persuade. They praised my contributions as if praise could be a proxy for remedy. They sketched a business context that rendered my pregnancy a coincidence rather than a cause. The mediator nodded with the practiced equanimity of someone paid to hold contradictory truths without letting the room split. Breaks punctuated the day, and each break functioned like a pressure valve slowly turning. In a quiet room, I placed my feet up on a chair and breathed like my mother had taught me: in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4. My body did not care about the structure of settlements. It cared about oxygen and blood flow and the energy required to build a person. Honoring that felt radical in a setting designed to reward whoever could sit the longest without flinching. I honored it anyway. The company moved on money first, as companies do. The number rose. The conditions did not. Confidentiality tightened like a belt. Non-disparagement broadened. The letter of reference became warmer while remaining void of the truth that would actually protect the next worker. I watched the offer expand in one dimension and contract in another, and recognized the tactic I had once used to frame product trade-offs for external audiences. I named the tactic in my head, smiled without showing it, and returned to the ask that mattered: remedy plus prevention. A payment without policy was apology theater. A policy without acknowledgement of harm was a press release. I wanted both, and I wanted the right to live my story without being punished for telling it. Afternoon light shifted across the room in long slats that reminded me of my grandmother's porch. Fatigue rose and fell. I did not chase it away. I kept company with it. My counsel adjusted our strategy in ways that maintained integrity without mistaking stubbornness for strength. By early evening, we had reached the edge of what could be done in a single day. The company requested time to confer with executives who had remained absent while others executed their preferences. The mediator suggested a recess and a return. I accepted the pause with the same discipline I had used to accept the wait between filing and this day. Some fights are sprints. This one had always been a marathon disguised as a meeting. I walked out into air that smelled like hot concrete and cut grass, and felt the peculiar lightness that follows a day spent holding your ground. The aftermath, I realized, would keep expanding. Resolution would not mean ending. It would mean a new chapter where the fight shifted forms, from negotiation to implementation, from grievance to guardrail, from personal to communal. The horizon held no guarantees except the promise I had made at the beginning, to remain a witness who refused to be purchased, a worker who demanded a definition of reliability with room for human life, a mother building a world where her child's future would not be priced against a timeline on a boardroom wall. Institutions rarely admit fault in full sentences. They express it through timetables, trainings, and carefully engineered language that gives up ground without collapsing the building. After the mediation pause, the company returned not with contrition stitched into prose, but with a sequence of commitments that could be verified. The offer expanded across two axes that mattered: remedy for what had already happened and prevention for what would otherwise happen again to someone else. Watching the shift felt like observing a tide pull back to reveal the objects it had been hiding. Nothing in the room was sudden. It was simply visible. The first pillar addressed the harm already done. Compensation was recalculated to reflect the consequences of a lost role during a pregnancy, not as a discretionary gesture, but as recognition that a career interruption engineered by bias has a measurable cost that travels beyond a single quarter. Benefits were extended beyond the bare minimum and structured to remove the cliff that punishes parents precisely when they need stability. A neutral reference letter was replaced with a factual one that detailed achievements and tenure without the hollow praise that sometimes covers the absence of accountability. Most important to the integrity of the arrangement was a carve-out that treated truth as protected speech rather than a reputational hazard. The confidentiality apparatus narrowed to cover only figures and identifiably sensitive business information. My lived experience and the facts of how I had been treated would not be locked in a drawer. The second pillar mattered more than any number. The company committed to codifying accommodations in policy rather than leaving them to the drift of managerial goodwill. Leave and coverage plans would be standardized so that planning for a joyful biological event would no longer be treated as an anomalous burden borne by individuals who were forced to audition for compassion. A mandatory training series, designed with outside experts who did not speak the gentle dialect of denial, would be delivered not as a webinar to be half-watched, but as a live curriculum tied to evaluations. People accustomed to treating inclusion as a checkbox would find it implanted in the spine of how their performance was measured. There were structural commitments. An oversight committee with authority would review any role changes touching pregnant workers and new parents, eliminating the latitude that allows bias to masquerade as urgency. An anonymous reporting line, audited by a third party, would track complaints and outcomes rather than leaving harm to evaporate in private meetings. Twice-yearly summaries of accommodation requests and resolutions would be aggregated and shared with staff. The reports would be anonymized and quantitative, but transparency has a way of disciplining systems that prefer fog. In the vendor ecosystem that had helped manufacture the pressure to replace me, there would be contracts revised to make client demands compliant with the law and the company's stated values. If a client pushed for exclusions based on pregnancy or caregiving, the account lead would be required to escalate rather than improvise. The firm would commit to declining work that demanded illegal accommodation sacrifices disguised as aggressive timelines. For an organization trained by venture velocity, this represented a realignment of what reliability meant. Reliability would no longer equal delivering at any cost. It would equal delivering without borrowing against other people's bodies. The letter that summarized all of this arrived with the engineered neutrality of counsel. It did not confess in the way a human might in a kitchen when faced with another human's pain. It enumerated. It scheduled. It hardened into tasks and dates. Reading it, I experienced the mismatch between emotion and mechanism and felt, unexpectedly, relief rather than disappointment. Emotion could not repair a policy. A date could. A metric could. A revision to who had veto power at key moments could. Warmth has a place in the aftermath of harm, but warmth does not keep a future worker from becoming a cautionary tale. Infrastructure does. My counsel advised patience and vigilance. Agreements are promises. Implementation is culture. The months that followed demanded a new skill, remaining attentive without becoming consumed. I learned to ask for updates in writing and to file them where future me could find them without sifting through memory's unreliable attic. I learned to celebrate small bureaucratic victories with the same care I once reserved for large campaign launches, because a small fix in a policy can produce a cascade of saved futures. I learned to let go once a milestone was met rather than hovering over it with suspicion, until suspicion became another job. Meanwhile, the world of my body continued its own governance. Appointments multiplied. Measurements were taken and compared to charts that turned flesh into numbers and numbers into reassurances that were always provisional. I walked the neighborhood in the hour before sunset when the heat released its grip, and the city's impatience settled into something gentler. I wrote lists that contained groceries and goals in the same ink, because life refuses to honor our attempts to separate the mundane from the monumental. The bassinet stood assembled now. The tiny socks had been washed and folded. The stroller leaned against the wall like a promise. My mother followed the developments with a hospital worker's stoic interest in measurable progress. She preferred deeds over pronouncements, dates over rhetoric. When I described the policy timetables, she responded with a quiet satisfaction that sounded like a story returning to itself. Evan tracked the budget and the build-out of our small space with craftsperson precision. Our home felt less like a holding area and more like a workshop where the next phase of our life was being shaped. Public reaction mattered in a peripheral way I had not anticipated. I had braced for online wolves and received, instead, a modest but consistent chorus of private notes from people who had endured similar harm without a screenshot or the stamina to push. The messages were not for public display. They were for my spine. They reminded me that personal cases are never only personal. They also kept me honest about the limits of what one case can carry. I could not fix an industry. I could help build a new rung on a ladder someone else might climb. When the board formally adopted the policy changes, I printed the brief memo that recorded the vote and slipped it into the folder that already held the text that started this chapter of my life. It did not feel like victory or closure. It felt like a hinge. The room had turned, not completely, not forever, but enough for light to fall across surfaces that used to live in shadow. I allowed myself one private ritual that day. I placed my hand on my belly and named, without words, the reason I had chosen the harder path. Then I opened my notebook and wrote the next set of unglamorous tasks that keep any hinge from rusting: follow-up, verification, reminders, rest. Transformation is a generous word that often hides the mechanics it demands. Repair is smaller, plainer, and truer to what followed. After the papers were signed and posted and filed, the work shifted from institutions back to me. The legal edges receded. The human edges reasserted themselves. I woke each day to a body engaged in the largest project it had ever undertaken. I woke each day to a mind adjusting to a future that no longer included the office where I had been needed in a very specific way. Losing a role had turned those needs into silence. Gaining a child would rewrite what need meant. Pregnancy's final weeks stretch time into a peculiar elastic. Days feel simultaneously urgent and endless. I learned to parent myself in the simplest ways: food when food did not appeal, water when water seemed like a chore, movement when the couch made a convincing case. I scheduled naps without apology. as if a manager lived inside me who finally understood the resource constraints. I tracked the kicks and rolls, and the reassuring rhythms that told me this small person was doing their part without awareness of calendars or cases. I practiced thinking like a parent rather than an employee. A parent of a first child and a person who had just fought a system share a skill set. Both must triage with calm. Both must decide what deserves response. Both must understand that not every fire is a fire. Labor arrived not as panic, but as a series of unmistakable sensations that brought me into the present with absolute authority. There were no slides here, no investors, no policy language. There was breath, pain organized into purpose, the forgetfulness of ego, the emergence of someone new into a world that had shifted and would keep shifting. I will not narrate the details the way birth stories sometimes do, not because they are not worthy of telling, but because what stayed with me was not a timeline but a threshold. On one side stood a woman who had defined herself primarily by her capacity to carry others' goals. On the other side stood a woman who understood that carrying has many forms and that the most ethical one begins with carrying herself. The first weeks were made of milk and light and exhaustion that complicated every feeling. Nights broke into intervals governed by a clock that paid no attention to the rest of the world's schedule. Days softened around feeds and diaper changes and the slow revelation of a face learning how to inhabit a body. Love arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a tide. It came with fatigue and fear and humor that saved us at 3 a.m. when the only choices were laughter or despair. Work emails ceased to matter the way a distant shore ceases to affect the boat once you are too far out to swim back. The case's remaining administrative threads were handled in pockets of time carved like small coves in a shoreline otherwise saturated by the needs of now. Grief did not vanish simply because joy had arrived. I missed the deliberate cadence of a team building something together, the particular mind meld that happens when smart people chase the same problem from different angles. I missed my desk as a landscape where my competence lived on display. In private, I allowed those feelings to sit beside gratitude rather than policing them away. Maturity, I discovered, meant acknowledging that loss and gain rarely take turns. They prefer to share plates. I wrote about both in a notebook that had become a companion to the baby monitor, capturing thoughts between feedings the way I used to capture insights between meetings. When the haze lifted enough for thinking that extended beyond the next nap, I considered how I wanted to work again. Returning to the exact version of my old life felt neither possible nor desirable. The fight had changed my appetite. I wanted to build containers for work that did not demand self-depletion, masquerading as excellence. Consulting presented itself as a structure where I could choose projects that aligned with the values carved into me by recent events. The first clients were small operations that wanted to craft policies before scale made empathy brittle. I helped them translate intent into checklists and calendars and accountability structures. The work was quiet, and it suited the new quiet inside me. I also built a practical resource I could not find when I needed it. It began as a document for friends and friends of friends, a guide to navigating pregnancy at work that skipped slogans and arrived at steps. It gathered legal basics, scripts rephrased as posture rather than quotes, templates for handoff plans that preserved dignity, and a section titled What to Do When the Story Tilts that walked a reader through documentation practices without turning a life into a case unless a case became necessary. I emailed it to a few people. It sprouted legs I hadn't planned. My inbox filled with notes that contained no fanfare, only gratitude that sounded like relief. Therapy entered quietly, not as rescue but as maintenance. The sessions focused less on the acute hurt and more on the habits that had made the hurt possible. I examined the reflex that equated worth with responsiveness. I examined the way perfectionism, so applauded in open offices, is often a fear of abandonment dressed in productivity. I examined the part of me that took pride in being the person who could be relied on precisely because she refused to ask for accommodation. Underneath, the examination lived the gentler work of building replacements for those habits so that my child would inherit fewer ghosts. My relationship with my mother softened into a new configuration where she was no longer the sole keeper of endurance. Watching her hold my child, I saw the ledger of her life change columns. Years of overwork had disciplined her into a rhythm that left little room for tenderness during the week. Retirement and grandparenthood multiplied her softness. She celebrated the small, rational policy victories with a hospital worker's respect for protocols that save lives in ways most people never see. She also celebrated the way I had learned to say no to forms of excellence that break bodies. The settlement's policy timelines began to mature into practice. Former colleagues, carefully and quietly, reported that trainings had shifted from checkbox to challenge. A manager told a friend of a friend that approvals for accommodation no longer required apologetic preambles. A prospective hire asked confident questions about parental leave and received answers that matched reality rather than airtime. These were anecdotes without legal weight, but their cumulative hum sounded like progress rather than performance. The economy of our home stabilized. Evan took on a few additional projects. I stepped into pay-per-deliverable work that aligned with the baby's schedule instead of insisting the baby align with it. We learned the choreography of 2 adults and 1 small person in a space not designed for grandeur. We ate meals that had been assembled hours earlier in spare moments, marveling at how much better lentils taste when they are a plan rather than an afterthought. We slept in shifts and measured success in hours of contiguous rest rather than in metrics that used to impress investors. The new numbers were humble and holy. As months passed, the story began to take on the shape of something I could place on a shelf without letting it define the room. I kept the folder with the message and the memo and the timelines, not as a talisman I needed to touch daily, but as an archive I could pull down when someone asked for directions through similar terrain. The baby grew into a person who smiled with their whole face in a way that restored my faith in the future each morning. Repair continued not as a project with an end date, but as a posture that informed how I worked, loved, and rested. The case had been a chapter. The life that followed was the book. Resilience is often misinterpreted as endless capacity. I learned to prefer a different definition, the practiced art of knowing what to carry and what to set down. The years after the case and the birth taught me how to pack lightly for a long life. I set down the compulsion to be available at any hour to any request that wore the costume of urgency. I set down allegiance to rooms that needed my silence more than my skill. I set down the habit of praising suffering as proof of value. In their place, I carried forward the structure of attention built during the fight, documentation as a kindness to future me, boundaries that transformed from barricades into paths, and rest as a discipline rather than a reward. Work resumed as a selection rather than a destiny. The consulting practice grew in increments that respected my home's metabolism. I took on clients who wanted more than glossy statements. Some were startups not yet hardened by capital's pace. Others were mid-sized firms that had been educated by their own mistakes and were ready to re-engineer from the inside. I taught leaders to map risk in ways that included the human variables they had previously categorized as noise. I taught them the arithmetic of retention that makes accommodation look less like grace and more like competence. I taught them to rewrite reliable so it described systems, not sacrificial individuals. Stories traveled. A podcast host asked for an interview, and I declined in the same polite manner with which I had once accepted too much. A small community college invited me to guest lecture in a course on work and law, and I said yes because the room would be full of people who might one day hold the lever from the other side. A local mothers group requested a workshop. I built a session that turned fear into steps and uncertainty into checklists that did not steal anyone's spirit. A few articles appeared about broader trends. I contributed quiet, unattributed language in the background rather than making my life into spectacle again. Where spectacle changes nothing, instruments change cultures. I chose instruments. At home, the child became a toddler with opinions and enthusiasm that remade fatigue into joy more reliably than any prayer I had practiced before. The apartment turned into an obstacle course of toys and books. and the kind of mess that signals life instead of neglect. Evan's bench remained a sanctuary of order and sound. Evenings were for music, blocks, and meals that stretched, because conversation, even the toddler version, slowed everything down to a humane pace. Weekends were for parks that bled into naps that bled into recipes that required stirring and patience. We were not performing a lifestyle for anyone. We were living. The settlement's reforms continued maturing, as policies do when they are nourished rather than merely announced. I received a screenshot, forwarded through a chain of acquaintances, of a slide from a company all hands where accommodation metrics appeared as a regular section rather than a special initiative. The graph was simple, the numbers were modest, and the effect was profound. Making a thing visible toward the front of the deck has a way of disciplining behavior more effectively than slogans on a wall. A new hire posted about a supportive leave experience without tagging the company, which is how you know the experience was real rather than incentivized. A rumor reached me that a client had attempted to push for a team change based on a pregnancy and had been rebuffed with a reference to policy and law. The rumor satisfied without fanfare. If it happened, it meant the hinge still turned. I kept the archive current, not because I lived in the past, but because archives shape futures. I updated the guide I had made for navigating pregnancy at work, incorporating feedback from readers who had used it in circumstances different from mine. I added a section for managers titled "What to Say with Your Calendar Rather Than Your Mouth," which outlined how to transform value statements into scheduling decisions that cost, which is the only language some cultures understand. I included a checklist for vendors and clients that made complicity harder to drift into. The guide remained free and unadvertised. It moved anyway, which is how the best tools travel. On anniversaries, I allowed myself brief rituals. On the date of the 917 message, I lit a small candle and sat for a few minutes with the person I had been before the text and the person I had become after it. I acknowledged the seam between them without nostalgia or disdain. On the date of the board vote, I walked with my child to a library and returned a book on time. A mundane act that reminded me that civilizational hope survives in structures most people use without thinking about the labor that built them. On the date of the birth, I assembled a photo album that mixed milestones with moments that would mean nothing to anyone else. The way the light fell on a blanket, the shape of a hand reaching for a spoon, the kind of laugh that becomes a family's translation of grace. I remained cautious about becoming a symbol. Symbols flatten. I wanted 3 dimensions. I wanted to be someone who made a specific set of choices in a specific context, and then turned those choices into tools that others could adjust for their own terrain. When people asked for advice, I offered frameworks rather than prescriptions. I taught decision trees that accounted for money and safety and stamina and rage. I reminded people that refusal is costly, and that cost is not a sign a choice is wrong. I reminded them that consent to silence can be strategic, but it should be made with eyes open to what it buys and sells. I reminded them that policy reform without cultural reform can be a hallway without doors. At some point, the company became simply another node in a network of institutions that had made a mid-course correction and moved on. I did not carry a ledger of grudges. I carried a ledger of lessons. One entry read, "Keep receipts and keep tenderness." Another read, "Endurance is logistics plus meaning." Another read, "The body knows when truth has entered the room. Respect that knowing." I used those entries daily in meetings with clients, at the playground while negotiating boundaries with a small person learning them fresh, in the grocery store while choosing ingredients for the week's meals that had to stretch time and care at once. The end of a story is often mistaken for a return to the beginning. I refused that false comfort. I stood at a different place in the same city, carrying different weights, setting down others. My mother's sentences still lived in my spine, but I had added my own. Evan's patience still tuned our home, but I contributed new harmonies. The case had not perfected me or broken me. It had clarified my shape. It had taught me what to do with a message that tries to turn a life into a project risk. It had taught me to choose a definition of reliable that will stand when my child is old enough to enter rooms of their own and evaluate the goodness of the tables they are invited to sit at. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to support this channel and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from and what part of this journey spoke to you most. Thank you for spending your time with me here. May your week bring the courage to set down what hurts and to carry forward what heals.